If an avoidant had to write a survival guide for relationships, the first rule would be run first, ask questions later. But what if I told you there's one thing that flips their entire script? Not by chasing, not by begging, not by waiting, but by doing the last thing they'd ever expect: becoming a panther. All right, let's imagine that an avoidant is trapped in a room with 4 different animals, and each animal represents a different kind of person they encounter in relationships. One that makes them freeze, one that makes them bolt, one that confuses the hell out of them, and one that makes them stay without even trying. Now, if you want to stop an avoidant from running, you need to figure out which of the 4 you are. And we'll start first by talking about the wolf. Now, wolves are generally loved by the public. I mean, when Game of Thrones was going on, wolves were all the rage. But they're not ideal for avoidance because they often make them flee instantly. All right, so what do we know? Well, the wolf is powerful, relentless, and laser focused on what it wants. In the wild, when a wolf locks onto its target, it pursues with single-minded intensity. It doesn't just hesitate, it doesn't question, it chases. And that's exactly why avoidants run the second they sense wolf energy in a relationship. So what does the wolf represent in this case? Well, the wolf represents an anxious partner, one who's desperately wanting closeness, reassurance, and commitment from the avoidant. The more an avoidant pulls away, the more determined the wolf, i.e. the anxious individual, becomes. You see, wolves in relationships believe that persistence, loyalty, and love will eventually win the avoidant over. But here's how relationships between avoidants and the wolf-type personality typically go down. All right, so at first the avoidant might soak up the attention. After all, being pursued can feel flattering. The wolf's unwavering focus, the way it showers them with affection and reassurance, it's a rush. But soon that rush turns into pressure. The avoidant's nervous system starts sending alarm bells, not because they dislike the wolf, but because the wolf's intensity feels like expectation, and expectation to an avoidant feels like a trap. Their instincts isn't to lean in, it's to pull away. Even if they genuinely like the wolf, they can't stay, because deep down it feels like they're being consumed. Now, here's the wild part. The more the wolf senses the avoidant slipping away, the harder it tries to fix things. It chases it, reassures it, offers more love, believing that if it just proves its loyalty, the avoidant will stay. But the harder the wolf tries, the faster the avoidant runs. All right, so let's do a quick recap of everything we know about the key traits of a wolf in relationships. They constantly are checking in, stuff like, are we okay? They want deep conversations immediately to prove deep emotional connection. They'll analyze every text, call, and delay for hidden meaning. They'll feel abandoned the second an avoidant pulls away, and they're going to try to fix the avoidant's discomfort instead of allowing space. One final thought on wolves. Now, a wolf believes that love is about effort, and in most relationships that would be true. But with an avoidant, well, the more effort the wolf puts in, the more threatening it feels. So what's the lesson here? Well, no matter how badly you want an avoidant to stay, chasing them usually doesn't work. A few days ago, I received this message from Kelsey. My avoidant ex proposed. We're engaged and getting married in 2026. I still look back at this program and feel so grateful for everything I learned. Then she makes this really funny extra comment. You've probably forgotten who I am, but this was the podcast that I did. And then she actually shows the podcast that we did together in 2023 where her avoidant ex literally said, I don't feel in love with you anymore, and then came back. Now, it may seem like Kelsey's story is special, but it's really not. I've seen this exact thing happen over and over again. The people who actually get avoidance to come back and stay like Kelsey follow a simple process that flips the power dynamic, making avoidance realize exactly what they lost. Now, I want you to have the Kelsey experience. That's why I'm giving you everything. My full course library, a private community, weekly live streams where I break down everything for you. And normally I sell all of this stuff separately, but for a limited time, YouTube watchers get 50% off everything for just a one-time payment of $97. No monthly fees, no hidden costs, just everything you need to make your avoidant regret losing you and reignite their obsession. So if you're interested, click the link in the description to get instant access. Don't wait because this offer may not last forever. All right, let's get back to the video. All right, let's move on to our second animal type, the owl. Now, unlike the wolf, the owl doesn't chase. It watches, it studies, it tries to figure out the avoidant rather than pursue them outright. And at first, this seems like a smart approach. After all, avoidants hate pressure. If you can understand them, maybe you can navigate around their fears, right? Not quite. Because while the owl doesn't scare avoidants away with intensity, it unsettles them in an entirely different way. All right, but before we move on, let's talk about what the owl represents in relationships. So the owl represents the hyper-analytical partner, the one who thinks they can outsmart avoidants by studying them like a puzzle. So instead of chasing, the owl will watch the avoidant closely, trying to decode their every mood. They'll read attachment theory books, Reddit threads, and psychology articles trying to solve the avoidant. Because they'll believe that if they can just understand the avoidant, they can predict their next move and maybe even fix them. In other words, the owl treats the relationship like a research project instead of a natural emotional experience. Now, I personally jive with owls. The entire YouTube channel that I'm doing right here is written by an owl. I'm an owl. I like to approach things analytical. Most avoidants don't. So how do avoidants react to owls? Well, at first, the avoidant might not even notice the owl. After all, they're not being chased or pressured. But over time, something starts to feel off. The avoidant can sense the owl's gaze, always observing, always calculating, always subtly adjusting to accommodate them. And this triggers something deep inside of them. Why am I being watched so closely? Even though the owl isn't chasing, its constant observation makes the avoidant feel exposed, like they're under a microscope. And the moment an avoidant feels studied rather than understood, they disengage. All right, so what are some of the key traits of an owl in relationship? Well, they're going to overanalyze every text and interaction, looking for deeper meaning. They're going to try to outthink the avoidant, predicting when they're going to pull away. They'll constantly research attachment theory to navigate the relationship. They'll adjust their own behavior too much, hoping to avoid triggering the avoidant. And they're going to treat love like a game of chess instead of one of genuine connection. One final thought on the owl. Owls believe that knowledge is power, and in most areas of life that's true, but when it comes to avoidance, no amount of analyzing can make them stay. The harder you try to figure them out, the more like a science experiment they're going to feel. And no one wants to feel studied like a lab rat, especially not an avoidant. Next up, though, is the fox. All right, so if the wolf chases and the owl observes, the fox plays a game. The fox understands something that the wolf and the owl don't. Avoidants hate pressure, so instead of applying it, the fox keeps things unpredictable. It knows how to mirror an avoidant's behavior, how to pull back just enough to trigger curiosity, and how to keep them hooked without ever fully committing. And at first, this works, and it works really, really well. But over time, the fox learns the hard way. Avoidants don't do well with their own medicine. So what does the fox represent in relationships? Well, the fox represents the person who plays the game, the one who understands push and pull dynamics and uses them to keep the avoidant engaged. Instead of chasing or overanalyzing, the fox mirrors the avoidant's energy, making them feel like they're the ones doing the chasing. The fox will play hard to get, knowing that unpredictability triggers intrigue. They're going to pull away just enough to make the avoidant second guess their detachment. They'll use charm, wit, and detachment to keep control of the dynamic. Now, at first glance, this seems like the ideal way to handle an avoidant, and for a while it works, but then it backfires. All right, so let's play this out. Here's how an avoidant will typically react to a fox. At first, the avoidant is intrigued. The fox isn't clinging to them, it's not chasing, it's not pressuring. In fact, sometimes the fox even feels like an avoidant themselves. Cool, detached, hard to read. And this unpredictability makes the avoidant lean in. But here's the problem. Avoidants don't trust the fox. They sense that the fox is playing a role, and that connection isn't truly stable. And because the fox operates in game mode, the avoidant never fully relaxes into the relationship. And eventually, one of two things happens. The avoidant gets bored since the fox never fully opens up. There's nothing deep to connect with, and the game stops being fun. Or the avoidant gets triggered. If the fox pulls away at the wrong time, it activates the avoidant's deepest fear, that relationships aren't safe. And instead of chasing, the avoidant shuts down completely. In the end, what starts as an exciting game turns into another detached, unfulfilling connection. All right, so here are the key traits of a fox in relationships. The fox will know how to trigger intrigue and keep things unpredictable. They'll know how to mirror avoidant behavior to make them feel safe. They'll strategically pull away to keep the avoidant engaged, and they're going to avoid deep emotional investment to maintain control. They also think that detachment is the secret to making an avoidant stay. A final thought on foxes. The fox thinks it's cracked the code. If avoidants hate pressure, just play it cool, stay detached. But the problem is avoidants don't trust the fox. They see the game and deep down they know it's not real. And no one builds lasting connection on a foundation of strategy. Now we get to the final animal, the panther, the only one that actually makes avoidants stay. Now, unlike the wolf, the owl, and the fox, the panther doesn't chase, they don't analyze, or they don't play games. They don't need to. The panther is self-contained, powerful, and moves on its own terms. It doesn't try to get the avoidant to stay. It doesn't try to figure out the avoidant. It doesn't try to trick the avoidant into engagement. It simply exists in its own power. And honestly, this is exactly why avoidants don't run from the panther. All right, so what does the panther represent in relationships? Well, the panther represents the securely detached person, someone who is open to connection but doesn't need it to feel whole. So instead of chasing or playing games, the panther moves at its own pace without adjusting for the avoidant's comfort. They'll stay emotionally steady no matter what the avoidant does. They'll have clear standards and walk away if they're not met. They're fully engaged in their own life. They don't wait for the avoidant to decide. They're unpredictable, not in a strategic way, but because they genuinely don't center their life around the avoidant. In short, the panther's energy is magnetic because it's not trying to be. But where things get really fascinating is how avoidants react to a panther-type person. So at first, avoidants don't know what to do with the panther. They're used to being chased. They're used to being analyzed. They're used to people trying to figure them out. But the panther isn't doing any of that. And that's where the avoidance curiosity kicks in. Why isn't this person chasing me? Why don't they seem affected when I pull away? Why do I feel more comfortable around them than I usually do? So instead of feeling like a target or a puzzle, the avoidant feels something different, something rare. They feel safe because the panther doesn't make them the center of their world. And ironically, that's exactly what makes avoidants want to stay. So here are the key traits of a panther in relationships. The panther is typically going to have an emotionally rich life outside of the avoidant. They're also not emotionally reactive to the avoidance push-pull cycles. They're going to set boundaries effortlessly, and they don't tolerate breadcrumbing. They're not focused on winning the avoidant over, and they move forward with or without the avoidant. So, the million-dollar question that most people have is, how do I become a panther? It's simple. You let go. Look, I've been doing this a long time. I've researched, coached, and watched hundreds of different strategies play out with avoidants and X's. People always want the perfect text or the right words that will unlock something deep inside of the avoidant to make them stay, a strategy that will finally break through their walls. But in all of my years of working with people, something clicked for me around 2022 after I got off a success story interview with Lee. You see, for years I had been interviewing people in our community, people who actually got their avoidant exes back. I was looking for a pattern, trying to find out what actually worked. And what I found wasn't some new sexy strategy. It wasn't about texting. It wasn't about a special phrase that makes someone's heart melt. It was something completely different. Every single one of these people at some point stopped trying. They gave up the chase. They stopped needing closure. They realized they didn't actually want their ex back anymore. They weren't following some tactic to pretend they had moved on. They actually just moved on. They evolved into a panther to the point that it bled over into other areas of their life. Now, the reality is that letting go is a paradox. It's only when the success stories let go that the avoidant finally took notice. That's when the avoidant reached out. That's when everything changed. Not because they played the game better, but because they weren't playing a game anymore. Because real deep connection only happens when both people choose it freely. And an avoidant will never freely choose connection if they feel like they're being chased, studied, or controlled. So here's the $1 million truth. The moment you genuinely let go, not as a tactic, not to get a reaction, but because you've outgrown the chase, that's the moment you stop being a wolf, an owl, or a fox. That's the moment you become a panther. But there is kind of this other interesting aspect of panthers that I haven't talked about yet. By the time an avoidant actually comes back, the panther usually doesn't even want them anymore. Why? Because panthers don't wait. A wolf waits, an owl watches, a fox plays a game, but a panther moves on. By the time an avoidant circles back, the panther has already built something so much better, a richer life, deeper connections, real emotional fulfillment. And once you truly step into that energy, the idea of going back to someone who needed to lose you just to appreciate you, it doesn't even feel worth it anymore. That's the power shift. This is what avoidants don't see coming. They assume you're always going to be there. They assume you'll always care. They assume that they can go through their cycles, and when they're ready, you'll still be waiting. But the panther breaks the cycle, because the panther doesn't just look strong, it actually is.